Welcome to Listen MKE Live, a community listening project of the Ideas Lab at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, WUWM 89.7, Milwaukee's NPR, the Milwaukee Public Library, and Milwaukee PBS. I am WUWM's Latoya Dennis, and today I am co-moderating this discussion all about Kenosha with the Journal Sentinel's James Causey. On August 23rd, Jacob Blake was shot in the back by a Kenosha police officer 7 times. He is now paralyzed and from the waist down. And since that shooting, Kenosha has been the site of a number of protests, demonstrations, and unrest. And today we're talking about Kenosha and how we got to where we are and how we move forward. So we're going to bring in first Marc Levine, who is a professor at UW Milwaukee. Marc, thanks for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be with you both.
So how did we get here in Kenosha? Can you paint a picture for me?
Well, we got to here in Kenosha sort of the same way that cities across the country have gotten to where they are, which is, highly segregated, highly unequal, limited opportunities for economic advancement for the Black community. I just finished a big study of racial inequality in the nation's largest 50 metropolitan areas. And I found in that study that Milwaukee, on a host of indicators, and I looked at 30 or 40 indicators running from poverty to employment, to income inequality, to incarceration, to school segregation, across a number of indicators, that Milwaukee ranked either last or next to last on a large number of those, and in the bottom 5 on almost all of them. So we've got a long history in southeastern Wisconsin, highlighted by our largest city and metropolitan area, Milwaukee, of having pervasive and entrenched and persistent racial inequality. As I argue in the paper, the Black community in Milwaukee has essentially the lowest level of well-being of any African-American community in the country. Well, if we zoom down 40 miles down I-94 to Kenosha, a smaller city, a smaller metro area, which was not, in that larger study that I did, but it will be in a subsequent one I'm doing on cities in Wisconsin. The indicators in Kenosha for the Black community look as bad, or in many cases, even worse than in Milwaukee. So if Milwaukee is sort of the exemplar of the worst conditions in which Black Americans are living in urban areas, Kenosha is even worse. Now, Kenosha is a much smaller African-American community. There are only about 12,000 Blacks living in Kenosha County. 11,000 live in the city of Kenosha, so the segregation level is very high. But in that small community, all of the indicators that we saw so negatively in Milwaukee are present in Kenosha. The Black poverty rate, for example, in Kenosha is 33%. That's exactly what it is in Milwaukee. 42% of working age Black males in Kenosha are either unemployed or out of the labor force. That's about the same as what we have in Milwaukee. Black household income in Kenosha is a little over half of what white household income is, and the typical Black worker in Kenosha earns about half of what the typical white worker earns. The other stunning statistic, especially in the context of Milwaukee, which we have now been sort of conscious of the fact that we are among the most incarcerated cities for Black Americans in the country, is that the incarceration rate for Blacks in Kenosha is higher than it is in Milwaukee. Mass incarceration is a very real part of the Kenosha experience, and I don't think it's any accident that the issues of policing and all of the issues surrounding the tragedy of Jacob Blake can be clearly linked to the issues of African Americans and the criminal justice system in Kenosha. So I think in that context, it's important to understand not only the overall economic context and the marginalization of the Black community in Kenosha, but also how that translates not just from economic indicators, but to this very important indicator of mass incarceration.
So, Marc, the president was when he was in town in Kenosha yesterday, he was asked a question about systemic racism. What role does systemic racism play in the conditions that exist in Kenosha and Milwaukee?
Well, if we define systemic racism as those institutions, those policies, those practices, not just an individual being discriminatory or themselves racist, but that there are institutions or policies or practices in the community that have unequal racial outcomes and indeed injustice and inequality baked in, then it seems fairly clear as we look at the data and as we look at the historical experience of Kenosha and Milwaukee, that systemic racism is very much a part of the issue. When you look at, for example, the mass incarceration rate or the rate of incarceration, and you see that Kenosha's right now, as bad as Milwaukee is, that Kenosha's rate is 80% higher than Milwaukee's. And it's actually better than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the rate in Kenosha was almost 3 times higher than it was in Milwaukee. I think we can see that sort of racially disparate approaches to issues are very much baked into the Kenosha experience. And the other sort of issue I would raise with this is to view the larger context of Kenosha's economic trajectory. I mean, Kenosha, as we all know, was an auto manufacturing city. The American Motors plant and then the Chrysler plant closed in 1988, and that had a massive impact on the overall economy. Kenosha has kind of reinvented itself, but it's reinvented itself in a way, and I think this is where systemic racism fits in. It reinvented itself in a way where African Americans are left absolutely out of the changing economy and not in any way benefiting from any of the changes. I mean, Kenosha has essentially become an exurb of Chicago. In fact, the Census Bureau defines it now as part of the metropolitan area in Chicago, of Chicago. The jobs that are being created along the I-94 corridor, very few African Americans from Kenosha are getting those jobs. And so I think we need to understand, in the context of systemic racism and also just persistent racial inequality, how the economic changes in Kenosha are affecting the African American community.
I think now would be a good time to bring in Dayvin Hallmon. And I say that because Dayvin is a former county board member for Kenosha. I believe you spent 10 years on the county board there. And during your tenure, I've watched floor sessions of you basically fighting and pleading with people to do something about the issue of systemic racism in Kenosha.
That is correct.
So talk a little bit about that. What were you pushing for and why, or did it not happen?
Somewhere, I want to say around 2015, I was pushing for Campaign Zero to get body cameras on our law enforcement, both city and county, to try to get de-escalation training for our officers and a variety of other things. And it all fell on deaf ears.
Why do you think that is?
Honestly, they just don't want it. In my gut, to answer that question, I would say Kenosha likes being racist and doesn't want to change. I was stunned when I made a visit to the UAW annual MLK Day dinner and saw all these faces that are auto workers, all these black faces I'd never seen in Kenosha before. And I started asking, where do you live? Where do you live? And the answer I got from everyone was Racine. And someone told me, the superintendent of schools, a white man who's Sicilian Italian, he said, Dayvin, we took all the black people in Kenosha to the border where Kenosha meets Racine and said, get out. And so you notice in some of the census data that Kenosha really doesn't have a significant black population until 1980. And there's just a lot of entrenched dishonesty from really everyone around their treatment of black and brown people.
Dayvin, can you talk a little bit about what that feels like to someone, an outsider who wouldn't truly understand what that systemic racism feels like? I know we could talk about the numbers, but as a black man, what does it feel like?
It feels like you have no hope. it feels like everyone around you is lying to you because they'll tell you that they're glad to have you. They like the policy that you write. I mean, I was successful in everything I submitted as far as policy, except anything concerning race. Everything else I did was extraordinarily successful. Even the very conservative Republicans on the county board, some of whom live in the city, some of whom are out in the county areas. Um, they just like being racist and don't want to change, and they're not going to.
So when you say they like being racist, right? Like give us an example of what you're talking about, something that you experienced. I know you've noted a number of things in the recent days since the shooting. Talk about some of your experiences.
Um, I recall walking to a county board meeting and passing a house where there were two white boys working on a pickup truck that would routinely fly the Confederate flag and drive up and down the street. And when I made my colleagues aware of this, of course, they were already aware of it. They knew, they just didn't want to say anything. And I said, you know, you all really need to take a stand against this because this is racial intimidation. And if this gets out of hand, it can lead to violence. Nobody wanted to do anything. Nobody wanted to do anything. One of the people on the county board who loved me the most was an 80-year-old who'd spent his entire professional life as a member of the United Auto Workers and had was one of the people to encourage me to run for assembly. Well, he was one of the folks who knew that Black people had been taken to the border where Kenosha meets Racine and been told to get out. So here you have all of these people giving you accolades, patting you on the back, telling you that you're their friend, and they're not telling you that they're holding the knife trying to twist it, trying to kill you.
How do you force change? I mean, you know, you tried to do it through legislation. You tried talking to people and indicating what it feels like and how you feel discriminated against. But how do you actually force it when you say that people don't want to change?
I don't know that you can necessarily force change. I think you can be a catalyst to help light the fire. But if other people don't want to add momentum or can't add momentum, then eventually, for your own self-preservation, mentally, physically, and spiritually, you have to just walk away.
I want to bring in Diamond into this conversation. That's like the perfect transition because Diamond, right now, you are working for change. So tell us a little bit about what it is that you're doing.
Um, so it really started back in 2016 with Dayvin. After the election, Dayvin really educated me on how city and county government works and what we need to do to press these people to get the changes that we want to see. So if we fast forward to George Floyd, Kenosha had its first protests in response to George Floyd on the 31st of May. And from the 31st of May until the time that Jacob Blake was shot, there were protests multiple times a week, sometimes every day a week here in Kenosha. And that's not something that's typical for Kenosha. Before that, I had only been to one protest in Kenosha, and I can't even remember what it was in regards to. But a lot of what we're working on right now, prior to what happened with Jacob Blake, is we're really pressing these elected officials and we're letting them know, number one, we're here. Number two, we know what we need to do to get the change that we want to see. And number three, we're going to hold you accountable to it. And if you're not going to give us that change, we know what we need to do to vote you out. So a lot of what I do is behind the scenes. I'm not really, I mean, I go to protests here and there, but I'm not a big protest person. I'm very small. I'm very agile. And so I'm not good at protests. So I like to work behind the scenes and I like to go to these board meetings and make sure that our elected officials know that we're watching them.
What change do you want to see?
I think one of the biggest changes that we need immediately is we need more representation and conversation with people who look like me and people who look darker than me. Because right now, there's nobody on the County Board of Supervisors in Kenosha that looks like me. And if they don't look like me, I know they don't look like my Black brothers and sisters because I'm blessed to have this lighter skin, and I know that it's a privilege. Another change that we need immediately is we need conversation. Sorry, I totally lost my thought, but we need that conversation. So the issue that we have, it's two big issues. So the first one is city government does not talk to people of color. There's one person of color on the entire county board. That would be Alderman Anthony Kennedy. And he's in a very tough position because he's the only person of color on the council, right? So the mayor and the aldermen who are really tight with the mayor, they don't talk to us. They don't talk to our communities. They work very heavily with clergy and use clergy to talk to us. One, that's very insulting. And two, it's not getting anything done. The other part of that, when it comes to conversations, is Black people are not showing up and holding these elected officials accountable. I will say I have a lot of hope that they will after this incident with Jacob Blake, because I've never seen the Black community show up like this. It's hard to show up in a place where you know that your elected officials don't care about you. So that's immediate change that we need now.
So I have a question. So to young people in activism, it seems like it was a lot of activism there, and I don't know if it was coming from, a lot of it came from other cities as well. Like I know a lot of people from Milwaukee came up there to support. But have you noticed a change in young people as after the shooting that you talked about hope? Is there hope with the young people?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of hope with the young people. So, I mean, I'm a young person, kind of. I'm a millennial, but what I see in the generation after me, these Gen Z kids, they're on a whole other level. They're very active. They know what they want, and they will do what they have to do to get it. They want to educate themselves, they want to educate their peers, and they want to get out there, and they want to be the change that they want to see. And so I have a bunch of hope for them.
Did you walk away? The president was in town yesterday. Biden is coming to town this week as well. What message needs to be heard or that they need to hear in order for there to be real change to take place in places like Kenosha, places like Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit? What do they need to hear that they don't right now understand?
I think something that they need to hear and what they don't understand is that we're here, we're educated, and we're willing to put in the work to get the change. And we know how to hold these people accountable, and we're going to hold them accountable. And so the message that needed to be shared yesterday during President Trump's visit is that the Jacob Blake family wishes for everything to be peaceful and for there to be justice for their family. They didn't want to focus on the fact that Trump was here because Trump hasn't communicated with them. Our president hasn't communicated with them. And frankly, I don't know, I can't speak on behalf of that, but there's no communication there. And so they wanted the focus to be less about Trump and more about their community. And I hope that when when Biden comes tomorrow, I'm really hoping that they get that chance to have that conversation, because that conversation with the family is so important to understand exactly what it is that they want in terms of justice and what they want in terms of this community.
Are there concerns about the shooting of Jacob Blake becoming so politicized and then nothing happening?
Oh, definitely. That's it. It really, in 2019, after the shooting of Tyrese West in Racine, Wisconsin, the way that was all handled and how close it was to home, I think it really prepared us for really what to expect. So we hope for the best, and we really hope that everybody gets the justice that they deserve. But the sad reality is, when you're a person of color in America, a lot of the times you don't get that justice. And so I think it's something that we're expecting for, maybe even preparing for, but it's not something that we're hoping will happen.
So I have a question for Marc Levine. So Marc, when you hear stories like this, and we know what the numbers show for Milwaukee and Kenosha and Racine and all these places, is there a urban city that we could turn to that turn things around, that we could say, that's a perfect example of how you do it? Can Milwaukee or Kenosha look to a city like that and copy their blueprint and turning things around?
You know, I get that question all the time because I do these studies on the conditions of racial communities across the country. And given the consistency of the difficulties in Milwaukee over the years, it's always, okay, well, you know, are there models? Are there success stories? And the short answer is, you know, there really aren't models in that way. I mean, there's no place that sort of is a nirvana. There's no place that has dealt fantastically with the issues of segregation, racial inequality, limited economic mobility, inequality of income or earnings. There are places whose statistics look better. And there are places where you have a more highly educated African-American community that's able to take better advantages of some of the jobs in the new economy. There are some communities in one area, which I think is kind of telling, that have significantly reduced their levels of segregation over the last 20 or 30 years. I won't go into the intricacies of how we measure it, but the measures of segregation have declined a lot in places like Dallas, Kansas City, Nashville, Atlanta, to a great degree. And so lots of cities that have in some ways been magnets for African-American out-migration from cities like Milwaukee and Detroit and Cleveland, places like Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Nashville, Dallas, for whatever reason, seem to be more open and have greater economic opportunity. Again, they're not nirvana. They have many issues of police-community relations. Incarceration issues are real in those places, but their indicators look better. There are some cities which I think have done things in specific areas of policy that we can say those things seem to make a difference. Raleigh, for example, decided in the 1990s that there would be no poor schools in Raleigh. Well, what do they mean by poor schools? It's a double meaning. One is poor performing in the sense of student achievement, but also no schools in which there would be an overwhelming concentration of poor students. That you wouldn't have concentrated poverty in schools. You would essentially deconcentrate poverty. And because of the disproportionate number of blacks who were poor, that de facto created a bit of racial desegregation. And it seemed to really be working. The school achievement gaps, the racial achievement gaps declined significantly. There was greater economic mobility, as we've seen from the data, for young African Americans. But in the late, actually after 2010, Tea Party activists, in many ways, I think, precursor to kind of what we're seeing now, took control of the school board, undid that policy, and so they're backsliding. Charlotte was another city that seemed to be a city that was grappling well with racial issues after the desegregation orders of the 1970s. But there's been an enormous amount of backsliding since the early part of the 2000s, and you now have a highly resegregated school system. And again, the data show us that Charlotte has among the lowest levels of upward mobility for African Americans. So I think, unfortunately, the short answer is nobody has the silver bullet. There are places that have greater economic opportunity, and we need to look at why that's the case. We obviously know the connections, of education to all this, and I think we can learn from the policy in other places. The one other point I'd just like to throw in quickly is Diamond and Dayvin were talking about. Political power is so important. The ability to mobilize and to actually have a voice at the table is it's not a sufficient condition. We know that you can have a majority of blacks on the city council and even a black mayor, and progress can be incredibly slow. You look at a place like Baltimore, where I'm from, and you certainly can see that. But it may not be a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary starting point. That if you're marginalized and if you're experiencing the kinds of political marginalization that Dayvin was so eloquently talking about, then you can't get to the next step of considering the policies and the strategies that you need to deal with those long-standing problems.
I wonder how you begin to deal with that marginalization, right? That can also present in ways of like generational trauma, right? So I was talking to someone in Kenosha, and they mentioned the fact that Blake's three of his children, three sons, were in the vehicle when he was shot, and how that might present when they return to school and they're dealing with teachers who don't look like them or anyone in general who don't look like them, and some of the problems that can start to occur. And when you have that sort of generational trauma, it seems as though it lends itself to more problems down the road, in which, Diamond, I believe you mentioned that at times Black people don't show up to these meetings. They're not there. And I wonder if that's all interconnected. And if so, how we begin to deal with some of that.
Someone in public life has to make the first step. That was one of the things that I tried to do. It was made abundantly clear to the county executive and the mayor that no one was engaging young people. And I mean, young people at that time, I would say anybody 25 and under. And that's one of the ways that Diamond and I got to know each other and become so close, other than Kenosha Pride. And it really starts there. I remember campaigning in neighborhoods, running for state assembly, and having people of color come out and say, no one has ever come and spoken to us who was in public office or running for public office. You're the first one we've seen. Somebody has to come out there and make that first step and be sincere, and then they have to bring other people who are elected with them. I firmly believe after situations like what happened with Jacob Blake occurs, every single member of your county board and city council should be holding meetings in the park, not just with the constituents of their district, but everybody. When you make these decisions, everyone is your constituency, whether they live in your district or not, because everybody is affected by it, good or bad. So I think the turning of the tide starts with that.
We have a Facebook question from Patty Pracer. And her question is one where it gets to like, who do you blame? So her question is, so who's responsible for the horrible situation in Milwaukee City and County? And I guess that could be expanded to not only Milwaukee, but as Kenosha as well. So who's responsible? Who do we blame? Do we blame the politicians? Do we blame the people? Do we blame the economic downturn? Do we blame the loss of jobs? Who's responsible? Like,
Kenosha is not like Milwaukee. These are very different political environments, and the people who run them have very different political backgrounds. In the case of Kenosha, blame the county executive, who was routinely told by UW Extension, the youth educators, that young people were not being listened to and felt like they did not have a stake in the community. In terms of Kenosha, blame the mayor, who looked at his director of the public library and said, I've noticed that the events that you have in the park, there's never any kind of violence. Can you convene a team and find a way to expand your work? And she did that. I was part of that, as well as a number of others. And when we finally got to the stage where we said, okay, we know what needs to happen here in terms of young people, particularly young people of color, and utilizing the arts as a tool to address a lot of this, the mayor just said, well, I have other priorities, and completely scrapped it. You blame a county board that has legislative authority and budgetary authority over the sheriff's department in terms of approving items from the federal 1033 program, when other communities across America have said, sorry, we're not going to do that. But the county board says, nah, we think it's a good idea for the sheriff to have these things, even though they don't come with any kind of training whatsoever for use. You blame the city council for allowing the mayor to delay in seeking out body cameras for his police department. I remember when I asked the mayor about it in 2016, 2017, he said, I need an attorney general's opinion on that in terms of how to guidance on the usage and the storage and the data and the handling of that. I said, write the attorney general and ask for one. He said, no, I'll wait. So really, that's where you lay the blame. That is where the blame lies. The end result of that is a population that's disaffected, is a population that is angry, is a population that's hopeless, is a population that feels forgotten. You can, being in public office, similar to being in the federal government, a member of Congress or the US Senate, you can step on the people that you serve and not care about them. And every single day you're in public life, you need to remember that and make sure that your every decision does not do that. That is where you lay the blame.
Marc, same question for you on Milwaukee.
Yeah, I would expand that somewhat. I would say there are. I don't want to be glib about this, but it's sort of like an Agatha Christie mystery. Who did it? Well, it turns out everybody did. There are lots of culprits in this. I certainly think Dayvin's right. You start with political leadership. You not only start with political leadership in terms of the specific things that they do, but also their openness to policies, their willingness to lay it on the line, to use political capital to raise the issue of racial equity to the top of the political agenda. Certainly in Milwaukee, which I'm much more familiar with than Kenosha, that's been a problem for forever. There was obviously active resistance and racist attitudes of Milwaukee governments in the 70s and 80s under the Henry Meyer administration and his very brutal police chief, Harold Breyer. But since then, even with more progressive mayors, racial equity has certainly not been at the forefront of their preoccupations. And the results we see, obviously, are all of the terrible indicators that I've documented in research over these years. So certainly political leadership and its willingness to invest in these issues and to move strongly on the issue of racial equity are important. But again, I would expand it. I think a strong discussion needs to be had about the role of business leadership in communities. And frankly, from what I know of Kenosha, this applies to Kenosha as well as in Milwaukee. To what extent, again, has racial equity been a primary consideration as corporate leaders who dominate economic development policymaking in regions? To what extent have racial equity issues been at the forefront? They really haven't. And in fact, many of the things that those leaders have done in their, I think, relentless pursuit of what they call free market policies have in fact disinvested in African-American communities and disenfranchised economically, as well as ultimately politically, blacks in both Milwaukee and in Kenosha as businesses move out of central city neighborhoods, as the business lobbyists insist on austerity policies, which mean low taxes for the rich and insufficient funds available for development projects in central city neighborhoods. That plays a major role. And I'll be a very specific example from Milwaukee. The dominant business organization in Milwaukee, the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce, has indicated in the wake of the George Floyd murder that I think their phrase was, "We march with you. We're on board with issues of racial equity." Well, and they've announced a program to expand, have corporations in Milwaukee expand hiring and to have the leadership of businesses look more like the racial composition of the neighborhood of the community. But at the same time, look what the MMAC has done over the years. I mean, the MMAC was strongly against a paid leave ordinance that was passed by the city of Milwaukee and then overturned by the state, mostly at the behest of the MMAC. Well, what could be more important, particularly for workers of color who are at the front lines of dealing with the COVID pandemic, than having paid leave? But the MMAC was strongly opposed to that. The MMAC has strongly opposed living wage ordinances that would destroy the market. Well, a disproportionate number of black workers are in lower wage jobs. A higher minimum wage, a living wage, would make a huge difference in narrowing some of those income gaps. MMAC and other business organizations have been virulently anti-union, leading to the culminating in the right to work legislation in Wisconsin. Well, as Dayvin was talking about earlier, I think he's on the same page as I am. The local UAW chapter, Local 72 in Kenosha, is a highly progressive union for the community as a whole, and particularly on issues of race. They took a very front and center role on issues of racial injustice. Well, so as we deunionize, that has a negative impact. So I think we need to look at not only the history of the policies that created these kinds of inequalities. So we go back to, realtors and segregation, banks not giving loans to African Americans, discrimination in schools, discrimination in hiring, and those obviously we need to totally get rid of. But then we need the affirmative policies. What can politicians and businesses do to really change the dynamic? And I don't think in Kenosha with the Kenosha Area Business Alliance or in Milwaukee with the MMAC and then the M7, really we've done any of that.
Dayvin, do you have anything to say about that?
I think racial equity impact statements need to be a consistent thing. They need to be part of every decision that is made. I heard the UAW mentioned and I had to laugh because in my mind, they're part of the problem. Mm. I'll say this. County board, when I was on it, I was making $6,000 a year, $6,000 a year, and having to work jobs outside that in retail, often for minimum wage or just slightly above that. I'm not anti-union, but let me be clear. Everybody knew that I couldn't feed myself. Everybody knew that for 7 months out of the year, I had no electricity. This was known. Nobody was fighting for me to have a union.
They should
They're
have.
part of the problem. They're part of the problem. They're part of the problem. And even the most progressive among them were silent on the historical racial evils of Kenosha that they knew about, but didn't want to tell their buddy, County Supervisor Dayvin Hallmon. So I'm sorry, I just can't co-sign that one. I just can't.
When you guys hear, for instance, in Milwaukee County, the county executive has declared that racism is a public health crisis. You hear the governor of the state talking about racism being a public health crisis. When you hear these types of statements, what goes into your thought process of things changing in places like Kenosha and Milwaukee?
The county executive of Kenosha has a copy of Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. I gave it to him in his office with his chief of staff, Jenny Tunkeys, sitting right there. My copy where the corners of the pages are turned down, where I got stuff highlighted, bracketed, where there's things that are explained well or things that I didn't know before that I think everybody should know. I'm quite sure he hasn't read it. If he has, then his government over the course of the last week has operated in a fashion that would make Jeff Sessions want to throw confetti. So no, I don't see it getting better.
Marc?
Well, it's funny because I tend to always be in these things the most pessimistic, but Dayvin may be more pessimistic than I am. I don't see things changing in the way that I really think they need to. I think we're really at an inflection point where it's enough is enough, and this simply can't go on. That said, I think it's at least encouraging that in Milwaukee County, as you said, there's a racism as a public health crisis ordinance, which can have a positive impact on policy. The Milwaukee Common Council, I believe, is considering or perhaps has even passed a racial equity ordinance, which essentially says city investments need to be filtered through and evaluated through a filter of the impact on racial equity, which I called for years ago, and I was absolutely pilloried for that by both public officials and by corporate leaders. Again, that interferes with the market. You can't put those artificial criteria on investment decisions. So, will we rethink larger issues of public policy? I have my doubts. Stuff obviously needs to change dramatically. and it needs to change, reverberate into so many areas. I mean, will we get to a point where, for example, 3 or 4 years ago, when we decided that the public was going to contribute $250 million to the construction of a new arena for the Milwaukee Bucks for 2 billionaire owners who could obviously easily afford it. Well, at the same time, the city was encountering, as was mentioned earlier, a lead poisoning crisis as great as apparently has existed in places like Flint with our lead-filled laterals that are disproportionately, again, affecting neighborhoods in which African Americans live in Milwaukee. The cost to replace those is about $750 million. So a piece of that we've spent for billionaires as a subsidy could clearly be used for making a contribution to the public health of the community, and in particular racial equity along those lines. So I think it's that kind of structural rethinking that we need to do, and we're a long way from that.
How do you think? Go ahead.
There were two things. I heard Governor Evers' name mentioned, and I want to point out two things. Number one, it is never a wise idea to seek National Guard reinforcements from states that are either Confederate or heavily Confederate leaning. That is a very bad idea, number one. Number two, what I don't see from the state government of Wisconsin, we have Hmong folks living in our state. They don't necessarily fare better than the Black folk of Wisconsin. We have indigenous people living in our state. They don't necessarily fare any better than the Black folk in Wisconsin. So where is someone on the governor's staff or the lieutenant governor or the lieutenant governor's staff convening all the people of color across Wisconsin who desperately need this stuff fixed just as much as the Black and brown people in Milwaukee and Racine and Kenosha? It needs to be a statewide conversation saying to the white people of Wisconsin, this is what needs to be done for the people of color across the state. And if the legislature chooses not to listen, then what needs to happen is someone needs to go to the statewide counties association, who has the listening ear of those legislators, and really push this to get this to change. That's what needs to happen that nobody that I can see is doing.
So, Diamond, I want to come back to you a little bit and bring you back into this conversation, because you're on the ground level at this point, right? And so, are you seeing the political will, and if not, how do you get the people to move?
I will say, on a less pessimistic note, I'll be frank and say I don't really expect everything that's happening with the racism as a public health crisis to bear a lot of fruits. But the optimistic thing that's happening there is a drastic difference in the conversations that are being had in public office in Kenosha between 2016 and now. They're drastically different. So when they voted on the resolution to declare racism a public health crisis, it passed unanimously, and there was only one county board supervisor who did not vote for it. That would be Supervisor Decker, and Supervisor Decker made blasphemous and frankly nefarious comments about Black women, and specifically. And what happened was Supervisor Terry Rose motioned and said, this is not okay. We can't be having this discussion. For one, it's not appropriate. And for two, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So in the most professionally way possible, she was basically told, like, you need to shut your mouth right now. And the motion passed, and then they voted on it, and it passed unanimously and just without her. So that being said, that is a drastic difference from when I sat before them in 2016 till now, because back in 2016, when Dayvin proposed the no hate resolution, which really touched on a lot of things that these new resolutions that they're coming up with now, they didn't want to have the conversation. It was, we don't have a problem with racism. We're not going to talk about racism. And if you brought up the word racism, it was like they shivered and shut down. So I will say at least the conversations are changing. And I think that changing conversations and the willingness to have those conversations and the willingness to see what's actually going on is really going to be a tool for us moving forward.
And so moving forward, I know that you've said that we need more engagement, right, from people who look like you. There needs to be more people who are in public office who look like you. Are there people there ready to stand up and take those positions, take on that call to action?
If you had asked me this question just a week and a half ago prior to the Jacob Blake shooting, I probably would have answered with no. Because it's really hard for the community to come out and, one, speak for itself, and two, fight for itself when, like Dayvin mentioned, they really feel hopeless. They feel hopeless. And like I told the County Board of Supervisors at their last meeting, Black people in Kenosha feel like you don't care about us. So prior to the Jacob Blake shooting, I definitely probably would have said absolutely not. They're not going to come out, and that's that. But what we're seeing now and the huge positive that's coming out of the Jacob Blake incident is our community is coming out strong. They're coming out large, and they are coming out ready. So there are definitely people, and more people now, who are willing to have these conversations with our elected officials and who want to have these conversations with our elected officials.
If I could jump in just for a second, I think, let me go sort of on two sides of this. We also have to keep in mind, aside from talking about who can do what locally, is that so much of this is shaped nationally and by the national political environment. And we have an unprecedented presidential election occurring in which one major political party is perfectly open to white nationalist, white supremacist kinds of approaches, themes, memes. So when we talk about, is there greater openness for issues of racial justice and racial equity in communities, and I think we see evidence of that within specific communities, we have to put that into the larger context of this. We're not having dog whistles anymore or racially coded campaigns. I mean, this is full on racialized campaign that's going on, and that obviously militates against the kinds of racial justice issues that we've been talking about. On the other hand, there is some evidence that some communities, the mobilization around Black Lives Matter has begun to change mentalities. And again, I don't want to exaggerate this, and this wouldn't be a solution overall. A solution like this would have to be a national one. But I was kind of surprised to see two cities in the country, Providence and Durham, North Carolina, both of whom have had their city councils considering, and perhaps I think in Providence even passing reparations ordinances, reparations legislation, and saying, to really come to grips with systemic racism and entrenched racial injustice in our communities, this is what we need to do. Now, neither of those cities, in fact, no city in the country has the resources that would be necessary to pursue that kind of policy. That has to be at the national level. And again, I think politically, that's a very, very heavy lift. But it seems to me that's an example that with political mobilization, that mentalities can change in local communities, and political leaders can be pushed to begin to consider out-of-the-box proposals and strategies to change these entrenched and pervasive patterns that we've been discussing.
That's definitely what I've been hearing when it comes to the push to get people to vote and to get them registered to vote for this upcoming November election. They're using, unfortunate incidents like what happened to Jacob Blake in Kenosha and George Floyd in Minneapolis to say, hey, this is why we need you to vote, get registered. And I know that at the event in Kenosha yesterday held by the Blake family, that there was voter registration that was happening. Yeah. James, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, that's very interesting that you mentioned that because yeah, we all need to vote. We all need to exercise that right to go to the polls and vote. And it's very unfortunate that the conversation is being had around a person who is now paralyzed from the waist down. And one thing that we did not get into is how a lot of the political leaders there said that this is not their Kenosha, the Kenosha that was burning. That this is not the Kenosha that a lot of people know, because a lot of the outsiders came to Kenosha and created all this heck about it. And you listen and know what the numbers show. This was the Kenosha that was there. It just never brewed over. It was a shooting that sparked everything to brew over. But the Kenosha was burning, and just a lot of people just chose to ignore it.
Yeah. I want to go to our guest for any final thoughts that they might have before we wrap up here. Dayvin, we'll start with you.
With all the ugly in Kenosha, I would encourage anyone and everyone to look at and support the work of the Black String Triage Ensemble. It was designed in response to all of the nasty that you see in Kenosha. So take a look at the Black String Triage Ensemble and try to support.
Marc?
I hope we take this moment, the summer of racial reckoning, starting with the George Floyd murder and now the Jacob Blake catastrophe, and use that as fuel for rethinking the way that we do economic policy in cities, and that we clearly push political leaders to make racial justice fundamental part of every political program that they put forward.
Diamond?
I think it's really great that you brought that up, James, because that's the exact truth. And that's what I want to get out there, is that this is the Kenosha. This is the Kenosha that was always there. And it's the Kenosha that I and a lot of fellow activists have pushed very hard to prevent from coming into fruition. But unfortunately, it happened, and they didn't listen to us, and it happened. So this is it. This is the Kenosha that we're working with. This is the Kenosha that's always been here. And they're going to have to help us. They're going to have to help us clean it up. They're going to have to help us rebuild it. And I don't just mean rebuilding downtown Kenosha and putting buildings back up. We need to rebuild our community as a whole. So,
James, did you want to add anything else?
I think they summed it up well. I mean, a lot of work to be done still.
Absolutely. And just as a note, you've been listening to Listen MKE Live. It's a community listening project of the Ideas Lab at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, WUWM 89.7, Milwaukee's NPR, and the Milwaukee Public Library, along with Milwaukee PBS. Thank you to Dayvin and Marc and Diamond for joining us today. I think it was a great discussion, and thank you to James for co-moderating with me.
Thank you.